All right. Hello, everyone. It's been a little while, but we're back with the library at Mount Char.
Oh, hey, we have the same copy.
Oh, no
I feel
way.
like, yeah, I feel like sometimes we have different versions or like stuff, but yeah, this time it's the same one.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm not sure that this book is necessarily popular enough to have like a whole bunch of different copy covers, but that might not be true.
Oh, maybe you might you might be right.
All right, so let's start with our first thoughts and impressions. I chose this book. So I chose it because one of my like favorite, I'll say tropes, is like warrior or adventurer librarians. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I love it. It's my favorite. And a couple times a year, like usually right around Christmas and over the summer, this used bookstore by my place has like a blind date with a book thing, and so they'll
Mm-hmm.
just wrap books and have like little plot points on the cover,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and then I go and get like $50 or $100 worth. I'll keep some and give some as gifts, and then take some to school, um, and put into my library. And so this one I was super excited about because it has my favorite thing ever, warrior librarians. Um, and I did no research before suggesting this, and it was not at all what I expected. That's not. I did. I definitely liked parts of it, but it was also a lot darker than I expected it to be. Usually, like warrior librarians has kind of like a campiness that
Mm-hmm.
I felt like this kind of lacked. Um, but I would say overall I enjoyed it. What about you?
I also like had no idea what this was. And like I'd never heard of it actually. Um, One of my coworkers was like, "Oh, I've heard good things about it." So I was like, "Okay," but also she hadn't read it before and didn't really know about it either. She just knew it was, there was a library that was like at the center of it. Um, yeah, so like she couldn't tell me anything about it. So I was like, okay. And then when I started to read it, I also kind of thought, because when I saw some reviews or like people talking about it, um, they basically said stuff to the effect of like it's dark, but it's really funny. So I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking of, like what it would be like tone wise. Like I'm trying to think of a good comparison, but I can't
Gideon?
necessarily think of one.
I actually kept making comparisons to Gideon.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Like Gideon is like I feel like this one does something similar in which it tries to like mix a whole bunch of things together.
Yeah.
Um but Gideon does it in a very like um yeah, in a kind of a more like energetic, like youthful sort of way where like it's so much of like what it is. And like it yeah, it's just very like different. It's a very different tone from this one. Um like what is it? I don't know if any like I don't know if you Tiffany have seen Pushing Daisies.
No. Is that the show where they bring people back to life?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I thought maybe it would kind of have a tone sort of like that. Um where like the premise is kind of dark, but it's still pretty like bright and like hopeful and stuff. But it's not necessarily, it's more like the only way that I can describe it is that it's like adult. Like it seems like it's supposed to be very like adult TM. Like this isn't for like necessarily it's not for teens. It's specifically not for teens.
Yeah.
It's for adults. And when you read it, like that's the impression that you get.
Yeah. I was like, when I bought this book and I decided to read it, I had every intention of reading it and then bringing it to my high school library. And then afterward, I was like, I'm not sure that's like, I think some kids would enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm like, I don't know how comfortable I am with that. Cause yeah, like I do think it's funny in parts. But it lacks it's too grounded in reality it's too grounded in reality, I think, for like, I don't think the violence is necessarily more graphic or more or worse than some of the things that happened in like Gideon, for example, but it's more real seeming.
Yeah, I think there's a different kind of like tone to it, especially because a lot of it is being done by like the father.
Yes.
Which is like it just has different implications and stuff. Like because you're right, like a lot of the stuff is definitely very like heart-wrenching in Gideon. Some like pretty intense stuff happens. But it's kind of like there's also a different tone to it, I guess. When things happen in that one, everyone acknowledges that it's like really bad, and you can see people like deal with something that happened, right? Like they're really deeply affected by it. But because this stuff is happening so often, now it's becoming matter of fact, or they're just like, this happened. And like we don't have time to be like, no one sort of acknowledges the severity of it, or you can tell that they're so used to it that they don't like they can't or won't dwell on it anymore. They're just like, you keep going. So I feel like that's like the two distinctions or whatever. It's kind of harder to take in this one just because you know that they've been through it so often. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And that actually kind of brings us into our next point. I thought that one of the strong suits of his writing was maybe not the characterization, but like the motivations of his characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like they felt very real. Like they were acting as like traumatized people would in a similar situation. They felt believable to me whilst also being very, otherworldly. I think that's actually kind of my definition of a good author, is someone who can bring a side character to life using very few words. And I thought that all of his characters were realistic and well fleshed out, even if he didn't spend a lot of time like actually fleshing them out. But I did not find any of his characters particularly likable. Even Steve, who was kind of seemed to be like the normal touchstone, I didn't find him to be likable. The closest character I found to be likable was probably Jennifer, the medical sibling. But yeah, I like that I found them believable and interesting, whilst not necessarily identifying with any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you get enough of an impression of them to like, because it's interesting in the way that this feels like it's not character driven, it's more plot driven. At least that's what it feels like to me. And like the plot is interesting, and like you do get to see some character growth, like Carolyn and Steve, for example. But yeah, it's just like you get enough of the characters to kind of make the plot work, but like you don't necessarily like they're not the central focus.
Yeah.
So, but it was still interesting to see them. It's definitely interesting to see the person kind of relate to the catalog that they have. I think that's neat. I'm not sure if we're like meant to understand anything about like people's personalities depending on like the catalog they have.
I read an interview with the author, and what he said was kind of the central theme of the book, which I didn't get from reading it, was that like we are kind of our choices.
Okay.
and so like the people became their catalogs. Like there wasn't something innate about them that led them to their to like where they were in the library. It was what they had like decided to be, which I thought was interesting. I mean, I guess when they were children, he said that David was strong for a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and like Jennifer must have been caring, and Carolyn noticed his accent when.
Mm-hmm.
But also he said that like in her life, if father never would have come, she was only passable at one other language.
Yeah, I found that interesting as well. I was like, I thought it was going to be like, oh, when you learned French or whatever, like you were really good at it, but like that was all the time you had. She had kids or something in that life.
Yeah.
But he's like, no, you just kind of did okay. And I was like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised too. So so he said that one of the central themes is choice, but he also admitted that like Margaret didn't have any choices.
Yeah, because I would say if it was choice in the sense that like that's what they didn't have, like because he like essentially kidnapped them all, and then like forced them to everything. I think Margaret is the perfect example of like she didn't want that, and she constantly like chose not to have that, but she had it like forced on her anyways. Which also like very horrific punishments for Margaret.
Yeah, for all of them. It was, I definitely could have done with a little less I don't know, graphic descriptions of child abuse.
Yeah, I mean, you get to a point like after you get to a certain point where like you don't need it anymore. Like you can just be like, and then he punished us or something, and then like the end, like, or you can just infer it or something, like whatever. But we don't necessarily need to know exactly what he did, because when you give us one example, like we are like that's already the bar for it. You don't need to say it again. Like that's already pretty bad.
Yeah. No, I agree. Or maybe just like less paragraphs on they burnt him alive. We don't have to go like 7 pages on how exactly that happened and what it looked like.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that was interesting about the characters is that like even the siblings, we weren't even introduced to all 12 of them. Like we don't know what probably half of their catalogs are. And like she never had a conversation with probably a full quarter of these people that she's lived with for 30 years.
Yeah, I thought that was like funny as well. I kind of thought it was gonna be like, well, actually, I mean, I guess like there's literally just so many of them that if we like took the time to, it would just be like so much. Now it's just so much. So I can understand why the author was just like, no, I don't think we're gonna get into all of it, just because it's too much time.
Yeah. In the book, it was in my head. We definitely would have learned.
It would have been cool, though. It is a very interesting concept, too. It reminded me a little bit of Umbrella Academy.
Yeah.
And the father adopts these kids and like makes them do a certain thing to save the world, basically.
Yeah, it was a lot like Umbrella Academy because he was pretty awful too.
Yeah.
He wasn't quite as biblically awful, but yeah, he was pretty, at the very least, emotionally abusive.
Yeah, I do find it interesting, this trope of like, because it's the same kind of thing, sort of. Like not in this sense, obviously, but the same kind of thing with like Dumbledore as well, where like your mentor puts you through something that's actually like quite horrific, like quite traumatizing, but it's like for your own good. It's for like the greater good. Like, I'm sorry, but I have to do this for like these reasons, and you don't know it until like the very end. And either like you seek them out, or you stumble across them or something like that, but your like guardian figure or whatever is not going to go out of their way to be like, this is what happened.
Yeah.
And that's why I had to do this.
I actually found that to be a little bit of a plot hole. Was that she had to like kill the rest of her siblings in order to take power.
Mm-hmm.
Like I understood why she had to kill David, because if she didn't, then he was going to take over the world and it would have been a much worse place. But I don't understand why she would have had to have killed the rest.
Their like reason for it was just like, no, they've seen too much and they had to die. I'm like, okay. I mean, I no, I don't think so, because didn't Michael survive? And
Yeah.
like they just let him survive. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I felt like that really like underscored that
Yeah.
that it was all bullshit. That I'm sorry, I'm probably not supposed to do that. That it was all nonsense, that they had to kill everyone to for her to assume the throne.
Yeah. It definitely seemed kind of just like I don't even know what necessarily, just to like emphasize the magnitude of what it was, or like what like the significance of it or whatever. Like, this is like what Carolyn is doing is so important that she has to like kill all these people or whatever to accomplish it, type thing. Maybe, I don't know, but it definitely didn't seem like you had to because you had to because you let Michael live. And
Yeah.
so I don't know.
Yeah. I found that to be like, and I feel like that wouldn't have, like, if like the author wanted everyone to die just for like, drama points or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
been like, there was no other way to do it. Like, not because they had to die, because they had to die. Just they had to die because in no other permutation of, in the future would it have worked any other way.
Yeah, I feel like that would have made the most sense, because isn't that also why like they couldn't let Steve be part of their like
Club.
group? Yeah. Like they specifically had to kick him out because they're like, but she needs you to not be part of this.
Mm-hmm.
So to me that makes sense. You've already done something like this before. I don't know why you didn't just do that again. Yeah. I was gonna say something else and I can't remember what it was. Was it something about? Oh, I also did find it very interesting that at first it was supposed to be David who was like the heir.
Mm-hmm.
I found that very interesting because I did also see the author talk about how the way that father says it, he says something about like he burned this child, was it like 9 times or something like that, so that he would have a monster to fight. But the monster kept winning, so he had to try and use the monster as his heir. And I think like you can interpret that as being like just, David just didn't have what it took or whatever to like become the heir. But what it's supposed to mean is essentially that like Carolyn was just too good. She was just like, she was too powerful. So it had to be her. Like, you had to turn your greatest like enemy into your greatest weapon type thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really neat. Other also studies like maybe one day I will like revisit this and um write like a companion or something in which they do have to fight this like monster Carolyn, which would actually be pretty neat to see like um the alternate future.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Well, like near the beginning of the novel, it said something like going back to like David, like not being the chosen one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it said that he was too soft to be a warrior. Um, and like he was a really nice kid, and like blah blah blah. And so then it took like it was almost like it was easier to turn people into being monsters than it was to turn them into being like good enough to take them down, because she was terrible, but I wouldn't have called her a monster, like as she was in the book. um and so I wonder, yeah, I don't know, I think that says something interesting about like human psychology, that it's easy to turn people into a monster and really hard to get them to be their best.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it would be harder to do when you isolate them like that as well.
Yeah.
I guess that's why you needed to have Steve. I mean, this is a problem for Superman. People talk about this a lot too, where like one of his ties to humanity is basically like his family, right? And then canonically his family die, his adopted parents, and then his like one tie to humanity is Lois Lane. And that's why it's like basically so important that you like don't kill her don't kill her off, and then in instances where she does die is when you see him kind of like go dark or bad or whatever. Because really like this is also explored in like the Watchmen, like Dr. Manhattan, where he's just like you get so isolated and you have so much like power basically that it's so hard for you to even care about something, because you're just like, well, why? You have nothing to connect you to this other like place or like person or whatever. Um, so yeah, I found that like on a much smaller scale, basically for the family, I guess, for Carolyn specifically, who like basically needed a tether, or else she just wouldn't have really cared.
Yeah, yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. um yeah, her lack of like when she took down the real sun and put the dark sun up there, her lack of compassion, like, actually kind of made sense to me. Like it was like no, I'm playing like cosmic chess. Like this is decisions that are eons. I am both in time and out of time. In 100,000 years this will be fine. uh and like, yeah, like I don't know, it made sense. It made sense that she was like so far removed from like the day-to-day decisions. Like when she was like, that ball of Everclear was $5,000, and she was like, oh, was it? Is that a lot? Like,
Yeah, whereas just like it, like I find that interesting as well, where you kind of need that removal to have it like to be able to make those decisions. This sort of happens as well in like Ender's Game, where they can't tell him that he's doing it for real. He has to think that he's still playing the game in order to be able to do all of this, because the actual sacrifices that he's making are like so they're on such a huge scale that if he knew he was like actually sacrificing all these lives, he wouldn't be able to go through with it, because Ender, like at his core, is extremely compassionate. Um, so they had to just be like, it's a game. They had to remove him really far from it so that he could make those decisions.
yeah, that's a really good comparison. I didn't think about that.
Well, Ender's Game.
Yeah.
I think about that sometimes in that sense. I think like some pretty controversial stuff came up about the author, and I was like, oh, well,
Yeah.
I did enjoy the book though. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. I actually read a bunch of the sequels, like the Bean sequels,
Mm-hmm.
and I really liked them too. I was pretty upset with the Ender's Game, or with a card, with Orson Scott Card's controversies. But yeah, I can still like the book. I can still like Ender's Game. Um, so like you said, kind of like again, this is kind of like a crossover, a bunch of genres.
Mm-hmm.
One that I saw a lot, like it's like fantasy and sci-fi and horror, and I think that that's pretty accurate. I thought that putting horror in there was pretty true.
Yeah, it was a lot more horrific, basically, than I was expecting.
Yeah, same.
Oh, sorry, I can like not adjust properly in my chair. Okay.
Yeah, and then there's fantasy and sci-fi because she kept saying there's no such thing as magic. It's all, with I guess the implication that it's all science.
Yeah, I found that interesting as well. I was like, oh, we're not going for magic. Sorry,
yeah.
What did you say?
I said, but it felt pretty magical.
Yeah.
And I would, yeah. But isn't there a quote somewhere that says science, like well-developed science is indistinguishable from magic?
Yes. Like I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember like what it specifically is or who says it. But yes, I remember that quote.
But that feels very true, especially of this.
Mm-hmm. But it does fit the tone as well. To me, I was like, why can't it just be magic? Because that's what it definitely feels like. But I guess the tone of it isn't necessarily that. I mean, it's very like detail oriented and specific. Like the idea of like a library or whatever, it kind of sounds more like it would be grounded in like reason. Yeah. So I can understand why it wasn't magic.
So like magic seems to be like something innate, and science is more like you can learn it. And all of these people were able to learn it in like a fairly short period of time, like less than 30 years. I know it's a little bit different because they said that like the library itself was outside of time, but but still, like that was like, so there has to be some, like science element there. If anybody off the street could learn this information.
Yeah. I can't remember if we like actually went into it, but did you feel like they did the blending of the genres well in this one?
Yeah, I did. Again, I could have done a little less horror. And I like horror as a genre, but this was, I don't know, too gritty maybe for me. But in general, yeah, like I thought that they did it's really sci-fi, but mostly fantasy, but actually fantasy thing well. I thought it was grounded in like reality pretty well. What else? What other genres do people say it was?
Not sure like which one we missed there, but I do feel like it did a pretty good job of like bringing the elements of those genres together as well. Even though I don't know, I think the reason why I took more like enjoyment of it, I guess. In like Gideon, again, this is the only one that we could talk about. It's like the last one that we read. This is like still like fresh in our minds. But I think it's probably just because that one felt so like gleeful.
Yeah.
Like you could like you could feel how much fun the author was having, being like, you bet you didn't see this coming. Like, and no, we did not.
Yeah. And that one was actually funny.
Yeah.
Like not just like spurts of humor. Like it was funny throughout, which kind of takes the edge off some of the gruesome things that happened.
Mm-hmm. This one is definitely more like dark humor. It's a tad more cynical, maybe that's what it is. Where like Gideon is definitely more hopeful, and that's maybe the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, which makes sense with Gideon being more teen lit and this being more for adults.
Yeah, I find that interesting too, because I also would have thought that Gideon would be categorized as like YA, but it's just straight up sci-fi. Like,
Really?
sci-fi, or was it fantasy? Yeah, it's not technically categorized as YA. It's fantasy. I want to say it's fantasy, but I can't remember if it's technically falls under sci-fi, but it's not in YA. Because I remember that's like where I first went to go get it, and I was like, oh, it's not here, actually, it's over there.
Oh, that is interesting, because I definitely thought it was YA.
Yeah, it feels more like it.
Yeah, and the main character's a YA. So.
Yeah, they're like young. I still find that very funny, the way that Gideon refers to those teens when she like, as teens when she's like 2 years older than them or something.
Yeah. I read in a review today that the reviewer didn't know how they felt. I can't remember. Okay, the reviewer didn't know how they felt about the book. But they described like the pacing as like a fever dream. And I thought that was really, really super accurate to the pacing. And I actually like that was actually my favorite part of the book was how it was paced. As it was like slog, 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 run. And I never found myself getting like bored and like needing to like take a break and come back. So I actually really liked the pace. I liked how it was written. I liked the pacing, but I also thought Fever Dream was pretty accurate.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely starts that way too, with that opening scene where I'm just like, what is happening? Which is obviously intentional. Like, Scott Hawkins obviously wants you to be like, what is this? So that you can keep reading. But yeah, I feel like the moments where I was kind of like, I'm done with this is when we like switch to a different like point of view or whatever. Like if it was starting to lull is exactly when it would like jump to something else. Yeah. Which I have to assume is intentional, where it's just like, okay, it's enough of this, let's move on. Which I think is pretty interesting, because it does feel kind of like I don't know like a good way to describe it. I guess it's a fever dream, but sort of like I don't necessarily know how I want to say this. Like jump cut, like we have this thing happening and then we have like hard cut to something different entirely. And then it's just constantly that. Like you don't necessarily go back exactly where you were before with the previous character, like with one character as you follow them throughout the book. Sometimes you just jump to something else and they're already in something else. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I found when Steve was the point of view character, I found that the story was a little less exciting, I guess. Like I was ready for Steve's point of view to end when it ended.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand that you kind of needed him, like he ends up being kind of like the audience stand-in because he
Yeah.
has no idea what's happening, right? But yeah, I felt kind of the same where I'm like, oh, like my opinion of Steve from the very beginning kind of stayed the same throughout the book, where like he didn't make an awesome first impression. And then I was just like, well, then I kind of felt bad when he died at the beginning because I was like, oh, I guess he's dead. And then they brought him back. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't like because he was introduced so quickly at the beginning and he died so fast after that. I thought it was just gonna like maybe she was just gonna keep meeting people and they were gonna keep dying or something. Carolyn, I meant. Um, and then I was like, okay, so we're gonna get to know this person. And yeah, he just kind of like my opinion of him super changed, even though I would say that he did go through like a little character arc, which was interesting. And I still like what he meant to the plot as well. Well, like for Carolyn specifically.
Yeah. I actually had to go back and reread when like we see him in jail. I was like, oh wait, I thought he died. It took me a second to realize what was going on. Yeah, I was really shocked at the end when he became the new son.
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
that seemed hardcore to me.
yeah. I mean, I guess because Carolyn just really wanted him to be like part of what was happening. I find it interesting too that I mean, I guess with the choices that she was given, there kind of wasn't like a whole lot that she could have done differently.
Yeah. Well, so I think that I kind of like explained it to myself with she needed to make sure David didn't win.
Mm-hmm.
Um but David wasn't moving yet. Like he was still, you know, centuries, decades if not centuries away from moving. So like did she need to take out her dad, or was she also trying to get revenge on him, which would, you know, it's fair. uh or was it just about making sure David never ruled? Or was this all orchestrated by father? Because he was ready to move on? I don't know.
That's a little bit of what I got, where it's just like I planned this so that you would destroy me eventually. Like I assumed that's what part of it was. It was a bit like I mean, not not really, but sort of. I mean, again, like this is not like Gideon the Ninth, but I keep comparing it to that. Like it's really not. But in the sequel, you get to meet God or like Father. I think they call him Father as well, actually, which is really funny. Um,
I really do think that there are a lot of comparisons to Gideon.
yeah, I'm just like on surface level, these are not the same books, but I'm just like, actually, you can make a lot of comparisons. Actually,
There's even some of like the warrior librarian trope, because that's kind of what the necromancers are, kind of.
yeah.
So anyway, I really do think there's a lot of comparisons to Gideon, and I don't think we're pushing it too hard.
It does make it seem as if like the only other book that I've read is Gideon the Ninth, so it's the only one I can compare it to. But yes, there's kind of like that sort of where like uh where it kind of looks like God or like the father figure played like the super long game where it got to the point where you didn't even notice that he planned for you to make his decisions because he wanted these specific outcomes. So it looked like you were making these choices because you know you came to these specific conclusions, but then actually it was like just God has been manipulating you for so long that it seemed like it was all your idea.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting. So that's from the sequel and not from Gideon, the first book. Harold the Ninth gets into a whole bunch of stuff. That one is a ride, I will tell you, but I don't think we could read it for this just because, like, I don't know. It's something.
I started it, but I couldn't get back past the second person. I'm gonna try it again in a couple months, but maybe
Yeah, like without getting too into it, obviously because this is for a different book, but it does something so interesting with point of view that I feel like it's set a new standard for me for, like, if you're gonna use specific point of view, like if you're gonna talk in the first or second person or something like that, now I want people to do something with it, like something actually plot related. I have never seen that done before. And Harrow does that. And I found that so interesting. That, like, blew my mind. But it doesn't happen until like almost 3/4 in. I will say that.
I'll give it another shot because I just liked Gideon so much that. Okay, but anyway, yeah. Did anything surprise you about the book?
Like just in general.
Yeah, like did you find any, like I was really surprised that at the end Steve was the new son. Like
Mhm.
that seemed to be like a tonal shift to me because she didn't she never like really went after, well, I guess that's not true. She did go after people she loved. But kind of like what you were saying is like Steve was the only person that was keeping her like tethered to her humanity, and then for her to like be like, actually, bye bye. I found that to be really shocking. Did you have any like moments like that?
Yeah, basically same. I was like, well, I guess now you can like stay together. And then she was like, JK. I was like, oh, okay. Because I had also thought like, all the time they spent together meant that she was just gonna like keep him with her. And then she didn't. It
Yeah.
was like, but at the same time, like it seems to fit the tone of this because it's still like still rather dark. So I can sort of see how that like fit, but at the same time I thought she was moving towards being like more feeling and more humane. So it was interesting to see that. Even though again it sort of makes sense because she like in general feels very detached.
Yeah. I was also surprised and like a little more than a little disgusted about how Margaret died. And I know that like Margaret chose it or whatever, but Margaret was crazy. So we don't like, maybe we don't let crazy people decide how they die. And that actually I think was probably the thing I had the hardest time with was like our protagonist burning someone alive in a really, really horrific way.
Yeah. I've definitely seen people talk about that as well, being like, I feel like Margaret didn't deserve that. And to be honest, I agree. Um, it's like I feel like well, they definitely all have like trauma, and I guess just some of them manage to like detach themselves from it enough to like not have it manifest the way that like Margaret did, who would be more like more outwardly or like what's the word um like more of what we envision when we think of crazy.
Mhm.
um So I feel like it kind of sucks that the one person who shows very obvious like mental illness um basically has that ending, especially because you know that like she was the one who like struggled with everything the most, or at least showed most outward signs of struggling with things. um I feel like it was hardest for her to adapt. um
Well, she had the hardest thing to adapt to.
yeah. Like all of the ways that, like basically the way that she had to like use her abilities, and stuff. um Also extremely cruel.
Mhm.
um so yeah, it's definitely like, it didn't sit well, I guess I should say, that that's basically what happened, because like after all of this, after everything like she went through, she had to be killed off this way. Like they couldn't even like do something like kind or like merciful for her. I feel like at least if you were going to kill her, they could have done something more gentle. um which
Yeah.
sucks.
Yeah.
It sort of it sort of reminds me of and like not really but sort of, in the like sense, or like in the way that like, spoilers I guess, though I feel like no one who is like has a TV or knows that Game of Thrones existed doesn't know the way that, what happens to Daenerys at the end. uh but like spoiler for Game of Thrones ending, um where like as soon as she starts to go like outwardly crazy, you have to kill her off. And I feel like that's like a pretty common trope where, if like, um, yeah, where they're just like they're so far gone or whatever, like the best thing to do with this person who shows outward signs of like mental illness is to just like either you put them away or you kill them.
Yeah.
um
Like Jane Grey kind of a thing.
Sort of, even though, that's like its own specific like Dark Phoenix thing, which is very interesting. um where that's kind of like you just have too much power. Daenerys is a very good example of you've gone Dark Phoenix and now we just have to kill you. um but yeah, something sort of like that.
Yeah. I thought it was a very unique plot. Like, I thought that I never really knew what was going to happen next. Like
Mhm.
like how everything unfolded. Um,
Yeah, it's not necessarily something we've seen before. Again, it reminds me a little bit of Umbrella Academy in the sense that you know something is happening, but you don't know how we're gonna get there. Like you can't really predict what it is that needs to happen so you can get to the end. You just know that it's something that's been like in motion for a while, but like it's very hard to predict where it's going. Um, I found that pretty interesting as well because I had no clue. I couldn't guess anything, which is interesting because it doesn't necessarily like it follows some genre, tropes, but at the same time, it doesn't completely map to something to things that we've seen before. Like it's not a very obvious structure.
yeah. No, because I do feel like it. Because sometimes if books are like entirely unpredictable, it's because it didn't play by its own rules, and that you feel cheated, kind of cheated when that happens. But I did feel like this book played within its own rules for the most part. Like, um, and so I didn't feel cheated that I never could guess what was going on. But
Yeah, to like to compare it to something else yet again, because we're going back to Game of Thrones. um, I feel like I can only talk about this book when I compare it to other things, but in that instance, anyways, where like Game of Thrones feels like something that we've seen before, like it has a pretty obvious structure, and like the plot twists and stuff come from at least in the at least in the beginning, come from people being people, where like they have motivations or whatever, but like sometimes you do things impulsively in the moment, but it fits within your character scheme. Um, when it gets weird is when you start doing things for the sake of like shocking people and they make no sense to the plot. But I feel like this one made sense. Like again, the way that like the main characters react and stuff, like I said before, because they're so detached from like what's happening, it feels like it makes sense. Like people who don't have a lot of like genuine warmth, who've been like who have grown up with all this like death and trauma, basically, I feel like would have a really hard time conceptualizing like the value of life and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's just harder for them also to form like emotional bonds and stuff. So it makes sense for them all to be pretty like isolated, sort of like they just they can't really develop a lot of feeling.
Yeah. And it makes sense that she pulled back from her siblings so much, or, you know, her siblings when she she knew at some point that they were all going to have to die, because like Jennifer kept being like, hey, come hang out with us. Or I think it was Alicia and Peter were dating and she didn't know. And they're like, how do you not know this? Like, you've lived with us for 25 years. So yeah, so she was even further isolated than at least some of her siblings were.
Yeah, it would have been like interesting to see again because you had so many siblings you could have played her off of. It would have been interesting to see kind of the array of like what that meant. But I guess because you have the excuse of she withdrew, you don't
Yeah.
have to get into all of them.
Yeah. But I would give anything to know, you know, I would really like to know what the 12 catalogs are. Like all of knowledge separated into 12 different categories would just be really, really cool.
Yeah, because you get to a point where like, okay, we've gone through the obvious ones. Like, what are the others?
Yeah. I also thought it was kind of funny that like part of the mathematics catalog was cooking. I don't know why, that just really like tickled me.
That's funny. I feel like you would put it like in the science realm. Um, that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what I would have cataloged it as. I guess yeah, I don't know. Maybe its own thing, but like I'm hungry. I'm gonna go talk to Peter because his catalog is cooking. And then also like the overlap between the catalogs are like they weren't allowed to talk, but there was so much overlap between the catalogs. Like even like if hers is languages, then isn't that everything? Like
Yeah, that is really interesting because it's kind of like it's like knowing something without understanding the context for it. Like that idea is very interesting. But that is kind of how you teach certain subjects nowadays. Like when you get into like um I don't know, like what's a good example? Business or like medicine or something like that. Like I'm thinking of like certain theories like that develop you don't necessarily know like the context for them, like the historical context for them. You just know what the theories themselves are.
yeah.
um because they're just like that we're not going into the history of it. You don't necessarily need to know that to know what this theory is and why we use it, like what it does right now. So I feel like that kind of makes sense in the way that we like teach things. It's not always intersectional. It's just the
Yeah.
one thing that you're studying.
Yeah, but sometimes they are like science and um the healing arts, like that seems to have like a direct correlation. Um, but but my point with that was, so if cooking is considered a mathematical art. So does it mean that the rest of them aren't allowed to cook? Or are the rules not that strict? Or
That's a good question. There's like I feel like there's kind of a lot of stuff where it's just like, can they technically do this thing? Like, or is it like removed if it's an everyday essential type thing? Like,
yeah.
they have to eat, right?
Um, yeah, I mean, even if they only know one language, and Michael knows many languages because of like the talking to animals, that's still a language. But anyway, that I guess at a certain point it gets pedantic. But
Yeah, I noticed that as well too. I'm like, oh, he learned the animal languages, and that was okay, I guess.
yeah, but I could be wrong, but I don't think she was supposed to know the animal languages. She was just supposed to know the human languages. No, that's not true because he had her learn the deer language. So that's not true at all.
Yeah, because she knew every language spoken by like any living thing.
Yeah.
Like real or imagined.
Yeah, because like she was reading poetry by storms. So interesting.
Which sounds very cool. That
Yeah.
like concept in itself is very poetic.
Yeah, it is. They were great poets. Yes, this is, like I said, like the powerful sorcerer librarian thing is one of my favorites, and I would very much have liked to play in that world and have there be like a Captain Planet thing with like our 12 catalogs combined. But there's a children's series that I can't remember the name of, and I meant to look up before coming on so I could plug it. That has kind of like a similar like line of storytelling, and I really like it.
No, that's cool. I like the idea of like you said, kind of like warrior librarians or something. I find that interesting. Just because it's cool to mix those two things. Especially because like librarians end up being like popular depictions of librarians end up being like no good. They kind of suck.
One of several not great stereotypes.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or anything else you want to talk about?
I guess I don't know. I guess that I don't know if I would have read this on my own, but it was interesting to like know what it was. And then also I didn't know that we were gonna get the explanation for the title. Like
Oh yeah.
I wasn't expecting that. They're just like, oh, we called it Mount Char because blah blah blah. I'm like, oh, okay. Like I always understand Char to be because I read Ella Enchanted as a kid, as like a name,
Yeah.
like short for Charmant. So I was just like, oh, it's like short for something or whatever, like that name. That's automatically what I thought of. I didn't think about Char like barbecue or like charcoal.
Yeah. I guess I had forgotten about the name and that we hadn't like come across like Mount Char. Like I expected, like that was just the name of the mountain, like a mountain somewhere. And then when we got the explanation, it was kind of cute. It was kind of a cute little way to end the book. One thing that I was not surprised about was that Steve was from her previous life iteration. I thought that made a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. I feel like once you got into it, you're just like, oh, okay. Even though like when they first met, even when they first met, I guess you kind of had the sense of like they had already met,
Mm-hmm.
like literally, and you just didn't see the first meeting, and that is actually literally what happens.
Yeah. Um, I liked the flashback to when he adopted all of the kids and the like, you know, when I saw this the first time, I didn't understand the Palapi language, and so I didn't know what was going on, but now I do. I liked that scene. And then I liked the scene where she had the conversation with father and like things were wrapped up a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I actually really appreciated about this book was that like almost a full third of it was about consequences. Like it was like the build up to this huge battle and decision and climax, and then and then it's the climax, and then like the falling resolution is usually like quite short
Mm-hmm.
in the novel. I liked that this was longer and it talked about like this is the problems with this, and some of which are fixable and some of which aren't. And this is how like I really appreciated that. Like I appreciated like that like touch of reality that like life like doesn't end at the major thing you do. You have to clean up from it.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciated that a lot.
Yeah. I did like the talk that she had with father at the end. Again, it reminded me of Harry Potter, where like Harry talks to Dumbledore at the end, where he's just like, "Okay, let me break it down for you. Here are the answers to these questions, these unanswered questions that I couldn't tell you before because I was dead." Umbrella Academy does the exact same thing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I found that interesting, and I do also like that because we've established that you can kind of like change things. I like that we brought up the idea of changing it, like what are your other options if you want to like keep everything, like if you want to stay with Steve. They're like, oh, bring him in the beginning, you can't do that. What if you just stay with him? He won't stay together. So
Yeah.
I like that we explore that option at least, even though it's still like kind of sucks. um it just reminds me of all those stories where like main character goes to like fantastical world, has adventure, but then has to come back. um I'm still of two minds about whether or not I like that, because in some instances like you don't have the choice to stay, you have to go back.
Yeah. If there was a sequel, I don't know if I would read it. I would probably Google it to see what had happened, but I don't know if I would read it. I actually think this story tied itself up in a very neat little bow. Um, and I like that. I like that, like, this story is told,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever happens next would be like, I don't need it.
Yeah, I feel you do eventually get to a point where like I don't like I liked what this was, and I don't necessarily need to go any further with it. Um, that is what I appreciate about this as well. That it's like a self-contained story because it is very difficult. I was talking about this with a coworker the other day as well, where it's really hard to find like fantasy YA that is one shot. Now all of it is in a series, so like you kind of have to decide whether or not you want to potentially invest in more than one book.
Yeah. In my personal reading life, I much prefer to read one shots. Not that I haven't read some amazing series, but it does make it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, especially if it's still like ongoing and like when you first discover it. Like with Gideon, I didn't realize that it was a series. I thought it was just the first book, and I was like excited for it to be a a one shot thing. I'm like, oh, it's got more stuff.
Yeah. Um,
But yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah,
It
it
was
was.
something different.
Mhm.
I think that's it.
Yeah, I think that's all I have too. So our next book is Legend Born, right?
Yes, that's
Do
Legend Born.
you remember the author?
Good question. My copy is downstairs. So what's the author's name? Tracy Dion.
Tracy Deonn. And I'm excited for that one. I think that's going to be a really good read. I haven't started it yet. I don't know if you have.
I'm partway through, but like it's kind of what it sounds like, but it's still good. Like
Good.
it's like on the like one of the taglines or whatever is that it's like a modern day Arthurian legend, which is pretty interesting. It's still like it's very YA. But yeah, if you like YA, it's good.
And I do like YA. All right, guys. So next book is Legend Born by Tracy Deonn. And then I think we're going to start the Resist Readathon in a couple of months. And that's all we have for you. So
We'll see you. Take care.
have a good evening or night, depending on where you are.